Sarah Martinez stepped out of her dusty pickup truck, the morning sun casting long shadows across the Marine training facility in California. The sound of her boots hitting the gravel seemed louder than usual in the crisp desert air. She had driven 3 hours from her small apartment in San Diego for this moment, carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and years of memories that still haunted her dreams. At 32, Sarah looked ordinary enough. Average height, shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and clothes that suggested someone who worked with her hands rather than behind a desk. But her eyes told a different story. They held the kind of steady focus that came from years of training, years of making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. The Marines had issued an open challenge through military networks and veteran groups. Anyone who thought they could outshoot their best marksman was welcome to try. It was meant to be a recruiting tool, a way to show off their skills while maybe finding some new talent. They had expected retired Marines, maybe some Army veterans looking to prove a point. They had not expected Sarah Martinez. The registration table sat under a canvas tent that flapped gently in the desert breeze. 3 Marines in crisp uniforms looked up as Sarah approached, their expressions moving from professional courtesy to barely concealed amusement in the span of seconds. "Morning, ma'am," said the sergeant behind the table, his name tag reading Williams. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of confidence that came from believing he was part of the best fighting force in the world. "You here to watch the competition?" Sarah set her duffel bag down carefully. "I'm here to compete." The silence that followed lasted just long enough to become awkward. Williams exchanged glances with his companions, and Sarah could see them trying to process what they were seeing. A woman, alone, wanting to challenge Marine sharpshooters. It did not compute with their expectations. "Ma'am," Williams said slowly, "this is a serious marksmanship competition. We're talking about some of the best shots in the Corps. These guys have been training for months." Sarah reached into her back pocket and pulled out her identification. Sarah Martinez, Navy Service Number 7742985. "I'd like to register." The Marine took her ID, his eyes scanning it quickly. His expression shifted slightly when he saw the service dates, but he still looked skeptical. "Says here you were, Navy. You sure you want to embarrass yourself against Marine shooters?" A small crowd had begun to gather. Word spread quickly on military bases when something unusual was happening, and a woman challenging the Marines' best marksman definitely qualified as unusual. Sarah could hear whispered conversations behind her, could feel the weight of curious stares. "I'm sure," she said simply. One of the other Marines, a corporal with arms like tree trunks, leaned forward. "What was your rate in the Navy, sweetheart?" "Yeoman? Cook?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "Special operations." The laughter started small, just a chuckle from someone in the growing crowd, but it spread like ripples on a pond. Soon there were dozens of voices joining in, the sound echoing off the concrete buildings that surrounded the range. Sarah stood perfectly still, her face showing no emotion, waiting for it to die down. "Special operations," the corporal repeated, grinning at his friends. "Right. And I'm secretly a Navy SEAL." More laughter. Someone in the crowd called out, "Maybe she was a SEAL team cook." The joke brought another wave of amusement from the Marines, who had gathered to watch. Williams held up his hand for quiet, though he was still smiling. "Look, ma'am, I'm sure you're a fine shot. Maybe you did some training in the Navy, but these Marines have been shooting competitively for years. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez over there." He gestured to a lean man with graying hair. "He's been the base champion 3 years running. Corporal Jackson just got back from winning the division championship. These are serious shooters." Sarah nodded politely. "I understand. I'd still like to compete." The crowd had grown to about 50 people now, Marines finding excuses to stop by and see what the commotion was about. Sarah could hear their comments, some amused, others genuinely concerned that she was about to embarrass herself. A few voices carried hints of something less pleasant, the kind of casual disrespect that came from assumptions about what women could and could not do. "Tell you what," Williams said, leaning back in his chair. "The entry fee is $50. Course of fire is 5 rounds at 500 yards. Prone position. Iron sights only. Best score wins. You sure you want to waste your money? Sarah pulled a crisp $50 bill from her wallet and placed it on the table. I'm sure. Williams shrugged and began filling out paperwork. Your funeral, sweetheart. Hope you brought sunglasses, because you're going to be watching these boys shoot circles around you. The comment brought more laughter from the crowd, but Sarah noticed something else now. A few of the older Marines, the ones with more experience, were watching her with different expressions. Not mockery, exactly, but curiosity. They had seen enough combat to know that sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones who looked least dangerous. Master Sergeant Torres, a weathered veteran with 25 years in the Corps, pushed through the crowd to get a better look. He had been running shooting competitions for over a decade, and something about Sarah's demeanor caught his attention. The way she stood, the way her eyes tracked across the range, evaluating distances and wind conditions without seeming to think about it. Ma'am, Torres said quietly. You mind if I ask what unit you served with? Sarah turned to face him. SEAL Team 3. The laughter died instantly. Torres studied her face carefully. SEAL Team 3. When? 2015 to 2020. 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Syria. The silence stretched out like a held breath. SEAL Team 3 was legendary, even among Marines. Their operations were the stuff of whispered stories, classified missions that only surfaced years later in heavily redacted reports. If this woman was telling the truth, you got any proof of that claim? Torres asked. Sarah reached into her duffel bag and pulled out a folded document. It was her DD-214, her military discharge paperwork. Torres took it carefully, his experienced eyes scanning the official text. His expression grew more serious with each line he read. Well, I'll be damned, he said quietly. The document confirmed everything. Sarah Martinez, Petty Officer First Class, Navy SEAL. Multiple commendations, including a Bronze Star with V device for valor in combat, specialized training in advanced marksmanship, close quarters combat, and special reconnaissance. 5 years of the most intensive military training the United States had to offer. Torres handed the paperwork back. His attitude completely changed. Ma'am, I apologize for any disrespect from my Marines. They didn't know. But Sarah was not looking for apologies. She was looking at the firing range, studying the targets that seemed impossibly small at 500 yards. The wind was coming from the southwest at maybe 8 miles per hour. Not enough to seriously affect bullet trajectory, but enough to matter for precision shooting. When do we start? She asked. The competition was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. But word of Sarah's credentials had spread faster than wildfire. Marines were arriving from all over the base, some jogging from their duty stations, to witness what was shaping up to be an interesting contest. The mood had shifted from casual amusement to genuine curiosity. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the base champion, approached Sarah with a mixture of respect and competitive interest. Ma'am, I've got to ask, how much shooting have you done since you got out? Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving. Every weekend. There's a range about 20 minutes from my apartment. I like to stay sharp. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Good. I'd hate to beat someone who was rusty. The confidence in his voice was not arrogance, just fact. Rodriguez had been shooting competitively since he was 12 years old. He had won every major Marine marksmanship competition on the West Coast at least once. His personal best at 500 yards was a perfect score. 5 rounds touching the X-ring in a group smaller than a quarter. Corporal Jackson, the division champion, was warming up at the practice range. His shots rang out in perfect rhythm, each one finding the center of his target with mechanical precision. Jackson was younger than Rodriguez but equally talented. A natural shooter who could put rounds exactly where he wanted them, even under pressure. The third Marine in the competition was Private First Class Chen, a 19-year-old from California who had broken every marksmanship record in recruit training. Chen was nervous about competing against such experienced shooters, but his raw talent was undeniable. His qualifying scores had been higher than most Marines achieved after years of practice. Sarah set up her equipment methodically, each movement precise and deliberate. Her rifle was a civilian model AR-15, well-maintained but nothing fancy. The scope mounts were empty, confirming that she would be shooting with iron sights as required. Everything about her preparation suggested someone who had done this thousands of times before. The crowd had grown to over 200 people now, including several officers who had heard about the unusual competition. Even the base commander, Colonel Morrison, had arrived to watch. This was no longer just a shooting contest. It was a matter of Marine pride versus Navy SEAL reputation. "Shooters, prepare for the course of fire," Master Sergeant Torres announced through his bullhorn. 5 rounds, 500 yards, iron sights only. Highest score wins. You have 20 minutes to complete the course. Sarah took her position at firing point number 3, between Rodriguez and Jackson. The concrete was warm against her body as she settled into the prone position. Her left elbow planted firmly, her right hand finding the familiar grip of her rifle. Around her, the other competitors were making their final adjustments, checking their breathing, preparing for the shots that would determine the winner. The targets at 500 yards looked impossibly small through iron sights. Each bullseye was only 8 inches across, and the X-ring that marked a perfect shot was barely 2 inches in diameter. At this distance, a tiny mistake in breathing or trigger control could mean the difference between a perfect score and complete failure. "Shooters ready?" Torres called. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the familiar calm that came before action. In her mind, she was not on a Marine base in California anymore. She was back in Syria, lying on a rooftop at dawn, watching through her scope as targets moved through a compound below. The same steady heartbeat, the same controlled breathing, the same absolute focus that had kept her and her teammates alive through dozens of missions. When she opened her eyes, Sarah Martinez was ready to show these Marines exactly what a Navy SEAL could do. The desert wind had settled to almost nothing, leaving the flags at the range hanging limp in the afternoon heat. Sarah could feel sweat beginning to form on her forehead despite the relatively cool temperature. Through her iron sights, the target at 500 yards wavered slightly in the heat mirage rising from the concrete, a dancing black circle that seemed to mock the difficulty of the task ahead. "Commence firing," Master Sergeant Torres announced. The first shots came almost immediately. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was known for his quick, confident shooting style, and his rifle cracked twice in rapid succession. Beside him, Corporal Jackson took more time with his first round, his breathing deep and controlled. Private Chen was the slowest to fire, clearly feeling the pressure of competing against such experienced shooters. Sarah ignored them all. In her world, there was only the target, her rifle, and the gradual squeeze of her trigger finger. She had learned long ago that marksmanship was not about speed or style, it was about absolute control. The ability to make her body do exactly what her mind commanded, regardless of external pressure. Her first shot surprised even her with its recoil. It had been 6 months since she had fired this particular rifle, and the familiar push against her shoulder brought back a flood of memories. Training ranges in Virginia where instructors screamed inches from her face while she tried to maintain perfect sight alignment. Live fire exercises where missing the target meant her entire team failed the mission. Combat situations where every shot had to count because there might not be a second chance. Through her sights, she could see the spotters at the 500-yard line raising their paddles to mark where each round had hit. Rodriguez's first 2 shots were marked as 10s, hitting well within the scoring rings. Jackson's single shot was also a 10. Chen's first round was scored as a 9, still excellent but not quite perfect. Sarah's spotter raised his paddle and held it steady over the X-ring. Perfect center shot. A murmur ran through the crowd behind the firing line. Most of the spectators were too far away to see exactly where the rounds were hitting, but they could read the spotter's signals. Word spread quickly that the Navy veteran had started with a perfect shot. Rodriguez fired his 3rd round, taking slightly more time than before. He was a smart enough competitor to recognize that he was facing serious opposition, and his usual quick shooting style might not be enough today. Through his own iron sights, he could see that his first 2 rounds had hit well, but not perfectly. He needed to step up his game. Jackson finished his 2nd shot, followed quickly by his 3rd. His rhythm was steady, methodical. The product of countless hours of practice, Chen was struggling with the pressure, taking long pauses between shots as he tried to settle his nerves. The crowd's attention was clearly affecting his concentration. Sarah fired her second round without changing position, her body rocked steady against the concrete. The recoil rocked her back slightly, but her sight picture never wavered. She had learned to shoot in conditions far worse than this, on ships rolling in heavy seas, in buildings shaking from incoming artillery. A stationary range with a gentle breeze was almost luxurious by comparison. Her spotter's paddle went up again. Another X-ring hit. Behind the firing line, Colonel Morrison leaned closer to Master Sergeant Torres. "What's her background again?" Torres consulted his notes. "Navy SEAL, sir. Team 3. 5 years active duty. Multiple combat deployments. Bronze Star recipient." Morrison nodded slowly. He had served long enough to know what those credentials meant. SEAL Team 3 was not a training unit or a support team. They were direct action specialists, the people the Navy called when missions were too dangerous or too important for anyone else. If this woman had spent 5 years with them and earned a Bronze Star, she was far more than just a good shot. Rodriguez completed his course of fire with 2 more solid hits. His final score would be 50 points out of a possible 50, with 4 shots in the 10 ring and 1 in the 9 ring. It was an excellent score, good enough to win most competitions. He rolled onto his side and watched the other shooters, confident but not complacent. Jackson was having a more difficult time. The pressure of the crowd and the knowledge that he was competing against a SEAL had affected his normally perfect technique. His 4th shot was slightly left, earning him a 9 instead of the 10 he needed. His final shot was better, a solid 10, but his overall score would be 49 out of 50. Chen finished with a respectable 47 points. Excellent for someone his age, but not competitive with the more experienced shooters. He was disappointed but not discouraged. Watching Rodriguez and Sarah shoot had been an education in itself. Sarah had been taking her time with each shot, not because she was nervous but because she was processing information, wind direction, temperature, the slight vibration in the concrete from foot traffic behind the firing line, every environmental factor that could affect her bullet's flight path. Her 3rd shot took nearly 2 minutes to fire. But when she squeezed the trigger, she knew exactly where it would hit. X-ring, perfect center. The crowd was getting larger and more vocal. Marines were calling friends on their cell phones, telling them to get down to the range immediately. This was not just a shooting competition anymore. This was a Navy SEAL demonstrating why her reputation was earned, and it was happening on a Marine base in front of hundreds of witnesses. Sarah's 4th shot came faster than the previous ones. She had found her rhythm now, her body remembering skills that had been drilled into her through years of training. The rifle felt like an extension of her arms, the trigger like a familiar tool that responded to her slightest touch. When the shot broke, she knew it was perfect before the spotter's paddle confirmed it. 4 for 4. 4 perfect shots. Rodriguez was watching her now with undisguised respect. He had been shooting competitively for over 15 years, and he had never seen someone shoot iron sights at 500 yards with such consistency. Each of Sarah's shots had been dead center, with no deviation, no lucky shots, just pure marksmanship skill, applied with surgical precision. Jackson was also watching, his competitive disappointment tempered by professional admiration. He understood how difficult what Sarah was doing actually was. Iron sights at 500 yards were challenging enough for experienced shooters. To put 4 consecutive rounds in the X-ring required a level of skill that few people possessed. Sarah prepared for her final shot, the one that would determine whether she achieved a perfect score or merely an excellent one. The target seemed smaller now, or maybe she was just more aware of how much attention was focused on her. She could hear conversations in the crowd, speculation about whether she could maintain her perfect shooting. She closed her eyes and took herself back to a mountainside in Afghanistan, where she had spent 3 days in a hide position, waiting for a single shot at a high-value target. 3 days of lying motionless, eating cold rations, relieving herself in a plastic bag, all for one moment when her crosshairs would align with her target and she would squeeze the trigger. When that moment came, there had been no second chances, no do-overs, no margin for error. Just the shot and its consequences. When she opened her eyes, the pressure was gone. This was just another shot, just another target, just another opportunity to do what she had been trained to do. Her breathing settled into the familiar pattern. 4 seconds in. Hold for 2. 4 seconds out. Hold for 2. Her trigger finger found its position, applying pressure so gradually that the shot would surprise even her. The rifle fired, and Sarah knew immediately that something was wrong. The recoil felt different, sharper than the previous shots. She had pulled the trigger slightly to the right, a tiny mistake that at 500 yards could mean missing the target entirely. Through the heat mirage, she watched her spotter raise his paddle and move it slowly across the target face. Left of center, right of center, back to the left. The paddle stopped at the 9 ring, just outside the X ring that marked a perfect shot. Sarah's final score was 49 out of 50. Excellent by any standard, but not perfect. Rodriguez smiled and extended his hand to congratulate her on outstanding shooting. Jackson and Chen joined them, all 4 competitors walking back from the firing line together. The crowd was applauding, recognizing that they had witnessed something special regardless of who had technically won. But Master Sergeant Torres was studying his scoring sheets with a puzzled expression. He had been keeping careful track of each shot, and according to his records, both Sarah and Rodriguez had scored exactly 49 points. The competition was a tie. "Ladies and gentlemen," Torres announced through his bullhorn, "we have a tie for first place. Both Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and Petty Officer Martinez scored 49 out of 50 points. According to competition rules, tied scores will be resolved by a sudden death shoot-off." The crowd erupted in cheers. A sudden death shoot-off between a Marine champion and a Navy SEAL was more than anyone had hoped for when they woke up that morning. Sarah and Rodriguez looked at each other across the firing line. Both were confident in their abilities. Both knew they were facing a worthy opponent. The friendly competition had taken on a more serious tone now, representing not just individual skill but the pride of their respective services. "1 shot each," Torres explained. "Closest to center wins. If both shots are equally close, we'll continue until someone misses." Sarah nodded her acceptance and began preparing her rifle for another round. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled. But inside, she could feel the familiar excitement that came before decisive action. This was what she had trained for, what she had lived for during her military career. Pressure situations where everything depended on performance under stress. Rodriguez was making similar preparations, checking his equipment one final time. He had been in shoot-offs before and knew how to handle the pressure. The key was to treat it like any other shot, to ignore the crowd and the stakes, and focus only on the fundamentals of marksmanship. The desert wind picked up slightly, enough to flutter the target flags at 500 yards. Both shooters noticed it immediately, calculating how the wind might affect their bullet's flight path. At this distance, even a light breeze could push a round several inches off target. "Shooters ready for the sudden death round?" Torres called. Sarah and Rodriguez both raised their hands to indicate they were prepared. The crowd fell silent, understanding that they were about to witness something extraordinary. 2 of the finest marksmen either service could produce, competing for bragging rights that would be talked about for years to come. Commence firing. Number, the revelation. The silence on the firing line was complete now, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft engines from the main runway and the subtle whisper of wind across the desert floor. Sarah could feel her heartbeat in her ears, steady and strong, each pulse marking time like a metronome. Beside her, Rodriguez was equally motionless, both shooters locked in the final moments of preparation before the shot that would determine everything. Sarah's mind drifted back to a conversation she had with her SEAL instructor during advanced marksmanship training at Camp Pendleton nearly 8 years ago. Chief Petty Officer Williams, a legend among military snipers, had been teaching a class on precision shooting under pressure. "The difference between a good shot and a great shot," Williams had said, "is not what happens when everything goes right. It's what happens when everything goes wrong. When the wind shifts at the last second, when your heart rate spikes, when there are 200 people watching you and your reputation is on the line, that's when you find out what kind of shooter you really are." Through her iron sights, Sarah could see the target wavering in the heat mirage. 500 yards away, the black circle seemed impossibly small, a dot barely larger than a pencil eraser from her perspective. The X-ring at the center, the bullseye that marked a perfect shot, was even smaller. Missing it by an inch would mean losing the competition. Rodriguez fired first. The crack of his rifle echoed across the range, sharp and clear in the desert air. He had taken less than 30 seconds to fire, relying on his experience and confidence to guide the shot. Rodriguez knew his equipment, knew his capabilities, and trusted his training to deliver when it mattered most. At the 500-yard line, the spotter raised his paddle and positioned it carefully over the target. Rodriguez's shot had hit slightly high and right of center, in the 10 ring but outside the X ring. It was an excellent shot, the kind that would win most competitions, but not perfect. Now, all eyes turned to Sarah. She could feel the weight of attention from the crowd, could sense the cameras that several Marines were holding to record this moment. In a few hours, footage of this competition would be spreading through military social media, generating debates and discussions that would last for months. But Sarah pushed all of that aside, focusing only on the fundamentals that had been drilled into her through years of training. Breathing came first. 4 counts in through her nose, hold for 2 counts, 4 counts out through her mouth. Her heartbeat slowed, her vision sharpened, and the nervous energy that had been building in her muscles melted away. This was the state she had learned to enter before every important shot. A zone of complete concentration, where nothing existed except her rifle, and her target. Her trigger finger found its position, applying just enough pressure to take up the slack without firing. Sarah had fired thousands of rounds through this rifle, and she knew exactly how much pressure was required. Too much, and the shot would fire before she was ready. Too little, and she would have to increase pressure at the last moment, potentially pulling the shot off target. Through her sights, the target seemed to grow larger as her focus intensified. She could see the rings clearly now, could make out the small imperfections in the paper where previous shots had been taped over. The X-ring at the center looked like a black dot suspended in space, waiting for her bullet to find it. Sarah began her final trigger squeeze, increasing pressure so gradually that she could not tell when the rifle would fire. This was the technique that separated expert marksmen from merely good ones. The shot had to surprise the shooter, breaking cleanly without any anticipation that might cause flinching or jerking. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that seemed louder than Rodriguez's shot. Sarah felt the familiar push against her shoulder, felt her sight picture lift slightly with the recoil before settling back on target. Through the heat mirage, she could see her spotter at the 500-yard line studying the target through binoculars. The spotter raised his paddle and held it steady over the X-ring. Dead center, perfect shot. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, Marines whistling and shouting their appreciation for outstanding marksmanship, regardless of which service had provided it. Rodriguez was the first to congratulate Sarah, offering his hand with genuine respect for a competitor who had outshot him in a fair contest. "Outstanding shooting," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying over the crowd noise. "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone shoot iron sights that consistently at 500 yards. You earned this win." But Master Sergeant Torres was not celebrating yet. He was walking down range with a spotting scope, needing to confirm the exact placement of both shots before declaring a winner. At 500 yards, the difference between victory and defeat could be measured in fractions of an inches, and Torres took his job as competition director seriously. The crowd followed him down range, eager to see the targets up close. When they reached the 500-yard line, Torres set up his spotting scope and examined Rodriguez's target first. The shot was clearly visible. A clean hole about an inch high and right of the X-ring center. Excellent shooting by any standard. Then Torres turned his scope to Sarah's target, and his expression changed. He looked again, adjusting the focus, making sure he was seeing correctly. Then he stepped back and gestured for Colonel Morrison to take a look. Morrison peered through the scope, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Master Sergeant, are you sure about this measurement?" Torres nodded. "Yes, sir. Dead center X-ring. Actually, it's not just center. It's the exact geometric center of the X-ring. I've been running competitions for 12 years, and I've never seen a more perfect shot. But there was something else Torres had noticed, something that made this competition even more remarkable than the crowd realized. Sarah had not just tied Rodriguez in the regular competition and beaten him in the shoot-off. She had shot a perfect score in the original 5 rounds. Torres had made an error in his initial scoring, marking one of Sarah's X-ring shots as a 9 due to the angle he was viewing it from. When examined up close, with proper equipment, all 5 of her shots were perfect center hits. She had not missed once during the entire competition. "Ladies and gentlemen," Torres announced through his bullhorn, "I need to make a correction to our earlier scores." After examining the targets more closely, Petty Officer Martinez achieved a perfect score of 50 points in the original competition, with all 5 shots in the X-ring. Combined with her perfect shot in the sudden death round, she has just completed one of the finest displays of marksmanship I have ever witnessed. The applause grew even louder, Marines shouting and cheering for shooting that transcended service rivalries. This was not about Navy versus Marines anymore. This was about witnessing excellence, seeing someone perform at a level that most shooters could only dream of achieving. Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. 6 shots. 6 perfect hits. At 500 yards with iron sights. That's not just good shooting. That's legendary shooting. Sarah was cleaning her rifle methodically, breaking it down with the same careful attention she had given to preparing it. Several Marines approached her with questions about her technique, her equipment, her training. She answered them patiently, sharing what she could about the years of practice that had led to this moment. "The secret," she told a group of young Marines, "is not any one technique or piece of equipment. It's consistency. Doing the same thing, the same way, every single time, until it becomes automatic. When you're shooting under pressure, you fall back on your training. If your training is perfect, your shots will be perfect." Private Chen, who had finished 4th in the competition, listened carefully to every word. "Ma'am, how often do you practice?" Sarah smiled. "Every weekend. At least 100 rounds. I've been doing it for 8 years now. Ever since I got out of the service. Marksmanship is like any other skill. If you don't use it, you lose it." Colonel Morrison approached the group, his expression thoughtful. "Petty Officer Martinez, I have to ask. Are you currently employed?" Sarah finished packing her rifle case before answering. "I work construction, sir. Mostly commercial projects around San Diego. It pays the bills." Morrison exchanged glances with Master Sergeant Torres. "Would you be interested in a consulting position? We run marksmanship instructor courses here, training Marines who will go on to teach others. Someone with your skills and experience could make a real difference." The offer surprised Sarah, but she could see the logic in it. Training the trainers, passing on the skills she had learned through years of practice and combat experience. It was appealing, a way to stay connected to the military community that had shaped so much of her life. "I'd be interested in hearing more about it," Sarah said. As the crowd began to disperse, Marines heading back to their duties and responsibilities, Sarah found herself surrounded by a small group of the older, more experienced shooters. These were the Marines who had served long enough to recognize exceptional skill when they saw it, regardless of which service had produced it. Master Sergeant Torres was among them, still shaking his head in amazement. "Ma'am, I've been running shooting competitions for over a decade. I've seen Marine snipers, Army Special Forces, Air Force Security Forces, even some CIA contractors. I have never seen anyone shoot like that." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez nodded in agreement. 6 perfect shots in a row. At 500 yards. With iron sights. In front of 200 people, that's the kind of shooting that becomes legend. Sarah shouldered her duffel bag, preparing to head back to her truck and the long drive home to San Diego. The competition had taken most of the afternoon, and she had work early the next morning, but she was smiling, genuinely happy, in a way she had not felt in years. For 5 years after leaving the Navy, Sarah had struggled to find her place in civilian life. The construction job paid well enough, and she had made some friends among her co-workers. but nothing had given her the sense of purpose and belonging she had felt during her military service. Today had reminded her of who she really was, what she was capable of when it mattered. "Thank you for the competition," she told Rodriguez and the other Marines. "This was exactly what I needed." Rodriguez grinned. "Thank you for reminding us that great shooting doesn't wear a uniform. It just is." As Sarah walked back to her truck, she could hear conversations continuing behind her. Marines discussing her technique, debating whether anyone on base could match what they had just witnessed, making plans to practice more seriously themselves. Word of the competition would spread throughout the Marine Corps, becoming one of those stories that got better each time it was told. But Sarah was already thinking about next weekend, about the practice session she would have at her local range. There were always ways to improve, always new challenges to tackle. Today had been perfect, but tomorrow was another day to get better. She started her truck and drove away from the Marine base, disappearing into the California desert like the legend she had just become. Behind her, 200 Marines would remember this day for the rest of their careers. The day a quiet woman with a worn duffel bag had shown them what true marksmanship looked like. The story would be told and retold, growing with each telling, until it became part of Marine Corps folklore. The day the Navy SEAL came to town and reminded everyone that excellence has no boundaries, no uniforms, no limits except those we place on ourselves. Sarah Martinez drove home to her small apartment in San Diego, her truck carrying a trophy she would never display, and memories that would last forever. Tomorrow she would go back to construction work, just another veteran trying to make her way in the civilian world. But today, she had been something more. Today, she had been exactly who she was always meant to be.